the first time I actually remember learning anything about racism was when I was in 4th grade. The first black student in our class arrived. His name was also Tony. And at lunch, he was eating something I had never seen before. It looked like a really big apple. And I sat down next to him and asked him what it was. He said, "It's a pomegranate." I'd never seen or eaten a pomegranate. And he said, "Would you like some?" And I said, "Sure." And he peeled it up and gave me some of the seeds, and they were good. And, we chatted. I don't remember about what. I do remember, however, that within a day or two, we had talked, and he came over to my house after school to hang out and play in the backyard and whatnot. At the time, I lived literally a block away from the elementary school, one not unlike this, with a big field out back. And didn't think anything of it. I remember we had a good time. I don't remember what we did. What I do remember is the next day walking home from school when I got beaten up fairly badly by 2 boys in a grade or 2 older than I was. My dad had to explain to me that was because Tony had come to the house the day before. This was the middle of the 1970s, during the height of the Boston busing crisis. And some white boys in my class, no doubt because of what they learned from their parents, decided that anybody like me who would have one of the black students over to their home or befriend one of the black students was okay to pick on. It was a strange lesson to learn. I remember my dad trying to explain racism to me. I don't remember much of what he said. But I do remember it was related to the color of Tony's skin. When I was in college in the mid and late 1980s, I started a chapter of the human rights organization Amnesty International on the campus. This afforded me the opportunity to meet a student we had at the college from South Africa named Tebogo, and she had firsthand experience of the apartheid regime there. And one thing that happened from knowing Tebogo was I got invited to the International Student Union meeting. And I went to my first one, and I was very nervous and very anxious. I was sweating, and I didn't know why I was so uncomfortable. I was looking around the room, and I kind of got this blank look on my face as it dawned on me. I was the only white guy in the room. And I remember that a student from Central America named Francisco looked at me and he said, "It's different when you're the only one like you in the room, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." One of the last things I did while I was in college was to apply for jobs like a lot of people do when they're getting out of college. One job I applied for was at a major nonprofit you would know by name. And I got a response back from the director saying, "Your resume looks good and I'm sure you'd be great, but we can't hire you. We already have 4 white men in the office and I cannot hire another one." Boy, was I pissed, but I got it. I was working at Amnesty International at the time of my internship, and I was working with people who were facing discrimination every day, denial of their human rights every day based on who they were, what their political beliefs were, what they looked like. It was difficult to go through that, but I understood. I still had a lot of learning to do. In 2003, I went to Santa Monica, California for a conference on volunteer programs run by religious groups. I was working for an order of Catholic nuns at the time, coordinating their international volunteer program where people from all over the world would come work at their ministries in various cities in Massachusetts and Harlem and Philadelphia. And part of what we did at this conference is we took the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is a questionnaire that grades you on or assesses you on how you're doing in terms of your intercultural awareness and ability to teach, learn, work, and lead others in a multicultural context. I thought I was going to do pretty well in the assessment, and I did very middling, to say the least, and it was quite a humbling experience. The inventory assesses you and gives you grades that are denial, which means you miss differences or deny differences, polarization, where you judge differences, minimization, where you de-emphasize differences, acceptance, where you deeply comprehend cultural difference, and adaptation, where you're able to build bridges across cultural difference. You know, I was hoping I'd get adaptation, and I was somewhere in minimization on the side towards acceptance, but not there yet. It was a learning experience, to say the least, and yet another instance in my life where, with the best of intentions and being what I believe to be a good and upstanding and concerned and heartfelt justice-seeking white man, I still had a long way to go in really understanding what living and working and doing justice with people of color and people who are different from me was like. The street corner behind me here is where we are currently having our standouts for Justice Woodbury and doing our Black Lives Matter visibility. In 2015, I attended my first Black Lives Matter march. I was living in the Houston, Texas area. Compared to the things we're doing now in Woodbury, it was massive, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, and I felt very intimidated. Militarized police force was everywhere, and I showed up dressed like a clergy person and just marched along. I didn't say much. And at one point, I was stuck on a traffic island, and I got into a conversation with a black woman standing next to me. She happened to be a nurse. And part of the conversation, she said, "Oh, and by the way, thanks." And I said, "For what?" "For being a white guy who just showed up and marched and didn't need to say anything." I thought about that a lot in the few years since, when I really wanted to say my piece about anything, and realize sometimes I need to learn how to step back. Sometimes I need to learn how to speak up. I was asked to speak at one of our Justice Woodbury rallies recently, and I really had to think about it. I'm trying to learn from our ministers of color and our leaders of color that the last thing we really need sometimes is another white male voice speaking. So I was concerned that other black leaders were not speaking, younger people were not speaking. I was finally convinced to do it, in that I had something to say as a Unitarian Universalist religious leader, and that I might be able to use my white privilege to speak out where people of color in the area still seem a little hesitant, and probably for good reason here for doing so. So it's all a learning process, even right now for me. I have to admit, I'm a little bit of a reluctant speaker this afternoon. This movement calls for the centering of black voices, black experience, and black leadership. So I've learned from ministers of color and religious professionals of color and other people of color who are leaders in things I'm involved in, that sometimes it's not the best thing in the world to have yet another old white guy talk. So with that up front, I will say I am here today and I support Black Lives Matter and Moral Monday, Connecticut, because I am a person of faith, a particular faith called Unitarian Universalism. And part of my faith is that we believe every single human being has dignity and worth. We believe that all human relationships should be governed by love and mutual respect and never by coercion. And I think we see a lot of coercion going on in the relationships between policing and black people in our society, among many other things. Now, although I am part of what is traditionally called a very liberal faith tradition, our faith tradition is predominantly white. It is historically a white tradition, and it's still predominantly white in the vast majority of our congregations today. But we are going through something that's causing all of us in Unitarian Universalism to learn a lot about how to dismantle racism and white supremacy culture. About 3 years ago, we had a national hire made for one of our top-level leadership teams, and they hired yet another white man. And there was a huge outcry. It caused a lot of conflict and dissension, not only among our national staff and our national leadership, but even in every congregation that was paying attention. People were taking different sides of this argument. The president of our Unitarian Universalist Association nationally resigned due to the conflict. And in place was put a team of 3 interim presidents, all people of color, to be in charge until we had an election later in that year. And what came out of that was a national denominational commitment to dismantle white supremacy culture in our denomination and in our country. It is really hard work. It is not easy. It's been very slow progress. Nationally, our staff in Unitarian Universalism is substantially more diverse than it was 3 years ago, substantially. But if you go into just about any congregation of ours in the country, including ours here in Woodbury, you will be lucky to see a person of color in the congregation. This has been a learning experience for me. I've been somebody who has decades of experience actually living and working in diverse communities and in situations with people of color. I was a teacher in a high school once where I was virtually the only white person in the room 95% of my day. And yet, I've learned a lot in the last 3 years about my own white fragility. It's a really humbling experience. And it gets to be uncomfortable sometimes. To admit you don't know. To admit when Sarah asks you to speak, your first reaction needs to step back and say, is this really a good thing? That's not something that comes naturally to me. I've struggled with stepping back a little bit and being led by people of color. One of the first things that happened to me after this conflict in our denomination happened was I was asked by some of my fellow ministers to be the president of the local chapter of our Ministers Association. And I said to the senior white man who asked me to do this, "Are you serious? Have you been paying attention?" Especially since there were ministers of color in our district. So this is going to be a challenge probably for all of us as this goes on, and that's okay. This year, I think the 4th of July gave a lot more people than usual in our country a chance to pause and step back and be very honest about the very mixed inheritance we receive as Americans. That this land literally was built on land stolen from other people who were exterminated, and then built by people who were brought here as slaves so that other people could reap riches. That is the way America is. The American Revolution was a bunch of rich white English men wanting to be free of other rich white English men so they could hog all the spoils of colonialism for themselves. That's a hard fact to stare strictly in the face. And if that makes us feel that, this country isn't maybe all it should be, we need to remember it's not broken. It was set up that way from the beginning to be to the advantage of richer, whiter men. In the current issue of the Christian Century magazine, Alan Charus writes that one reason so many white people now have become involved and supportive of Black Lives Matter is that traditionally and predominantly white congregations are closed. And what might normally have happened is that those white congregations might have held vigils or started a study group or a book club. But there was no meeting place for those to happen except online. So to get together with people to make a difference, they had to get out in the streets finally. That's really interesting. Polite white culture would rather hold a class or read a book than take a risk at being arrested. As white people, we tend to see disruptions in our social fabric as something that can be treated by a seminar, a study group, a class, and we tend to stay away from direct confrontation. Ibram X. Kendi reminds us that because racism is not individual acts of discrimination and hatred and violence, It cannot be cured by education. It is a systemic thing that involves every major system in our culture: law, government, education, healthcare, religion. It is pervasive and ever-present. Progress is difficult because people do not like change. But it's not the change itself that's the problem. When people see the disruption caused by Black Lives Matter, what people in our society don't like is that they're afraid of what they'll lose when those changes happen. And that's why people resist this. And you can understand why, even if you don't agree with it. Because there's a lot of privilege and power to be lost. And power never gives up control without a struggle. This we know. So I want to ask you and remind you to not be afraid as you go forward. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid, and don't take it personally if someone corrects you and says something that you thought or said or something you did was a bit racist. Don't be afraid to do something that makes you even more uncomfortable than you've already been. Perhaps the next step for some of us might be laying down on a highway in New Haven. Those are different steps we take, increasingly stronger. I want to invite you to be continually uncomfortable with me. And if we can be uncomfortable enough together, I think we can finally affect some change. This actually is a matter of life and death. And the thing is, it always has been.